Hi Booktube, it's Ros of Scally Handling About the Books.
And Tilly of Tilly's Shelf. And just apologies in advance for any strange drilling or odd noises that are coming from outside. We'll just ignore them.
Ignore them. And it's Victober.
Which we love.
And
Ross is a co-host this year.
Yeah. And another of the co-hosts,
Marissa from Blatantly Bookish,
did a video last week about her 5 favourite Victorian novels that she's read in the last 5 years.
And we thought that sounds brilliant. We'll do. We'll turn it into a tag.
That sounds to me like I think the weird phrase is that it weaponise it into a tag, which is very peculiar.
Yes.
We'll magically transform this into a tag and invite you, anyone who fancies, to do this. And so it's 5 Victorian novels that you've read in the last 5 years, not your old favourites that you've reread lots of times. You know, ones you've read either for the first time in the last 5 years, or ones that perhaps you read as a teenager and you've come back to now.
So for me, for instance, that excludes Jane Eyre because I've read it that many times that, it's never a new read. No. But there's some books I've included, most of the books in fact that I've included, I read when I was quite young and didn't quite have the appreciation, I suppose.
Yeah. So we're just going to dive in. And no
particular order.
No particular order. These are not ranked. It's more like and my first that I'm going to say is Bleak House.
There we go.
A gorgeous, wonderful, big fat classic Victorian home that you, when you're reading it, you just can't bear to put down because it's so enjoyable.
And there's a bookmark in it right now because I'm reading it at the moment. And I did debate whether I could count this as one of my favourite Victorian books, even though I'm only a third of the way through it, because I'm loving it so much.
And I've read lots of Dickens over the years, but I had never read Bleak House. And it really was Victober and, particularly Katie of Books and Things infusing about Bleak House.
Because she's got so much passion for Dickens.
Yeah, that just pushed me over the edge to read this one a couple of years ago. And I'm so glad I did.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that I've launched into it for this year, although I may not finish it in October. It might take me a bit longer than that.
Yeah.
So I've also got a Dickens, and I also probably have to thank Katie of Books and Things, because it's our mutual friend. And I first read this as like an extra literary book group thing at college when I was about 17, and I loved it then, but then Katie was talking so much about how much she loved it that I reread it for Victober. I think it might have been the first Victober that I did, and I did it as an audiobook, and I was just blown away by the way it all hangs together. And I think the same is true of Bleak House, just the way that he builds this kind of complex web of characters and just makes it all work. I love, and in this edition's got some lovely illustrations and things as well.
There we go.
Trying on for the doll's dressmaker. So we both had a Dickens.
We both had a Dickens. The other author that we've both got, I think, is George Eliot. Now, George Eliot is absolutely one of my favourite authors. But actually, there was quite a few George Eliot. She hasn't written that much, but I used to say she was one of my favourite authors on the strength of kind of just a couple of books.
Yeah.
And again, Victober, I think this sort of gave, but also Kim of Middle of the Book March's Eliot group, 2 things that kind of pushed me to really read
more Eliot.
And I've now read all the Eliot's full-length novels, and 2 of them feature in my top 5.
Well, tell us about the ones that feature in your top 5 then.
One of them was her first novel, Adam Bede, and I read that with the Eliot group. I found that a really, really emotionally touching
novel.
Because
I've not read it, but
I would strongly recommend it. And although I couldn't imagine anything ever supplanting Middlemarch as my favourite Eliot, actually in some ways I love Adam Bede the best. It's not her most perfect book, because but it's has a huge emotional resonance. I suppose, and the characters are just so wonderful. Her humanity about her characters is the thing I love about Eliot. Yeah, you've got an Eliot too.
I've got an Eliot too. My Eliot is a little bit less challenging. It's Silas Marner, and it's
just so challenging.
It's not the same as Adam Bede, I suppose. It's emotional. It's endearing. it's like a fable. It again, like the Dickens, it just fits together really well, and everything kind of slots into place.
And when people say, where should you start with George Eliot?
Definitely with
Silas Marner is always my recommendation.
Speaking of somebody who's started and failed to finish 2 other Eliot books, this is the one I got to the end of.
Which brings me to my other Eliot.
Yes.
And talking about starting and failing to finish, just going to have a bit of a dig now, because the other Eliot that is on my list of 5 is Romola, which is Eliot's historical fiction novel set in Florence in the Renaissance. And I started reading it
as a group read with myself and Joseph Francis Burton.
Yeah. And I don't quite know what happened, but it was only me that actually finished it.
I tried, but
and life was complicated.
Yeah, I found it a bit heavy going for the time.
In the circumstances of, and that's something to remember, isn't it? When you always that.
Sometimes it's the right book at the wrong time.
Yes, that it's not the book's fault. It's where you are in your life.
And I'll come back to.
You will come back to Romola, and weirdly, Romola is the only book, and we've talked about excluding sort of recent rereads from this book, but Romola is also a relatively recent reread, because I actually chose to reread Romola within the last 5 years with the Eliot, Pym's Eliot group, because the first time I read it, I was thrown by the fact that it was so different, because it was historical fiction, and I sort of, I enjoyed it, but I had that feeling that if I reread it, I would really love it, and that is absolutely what happened.
So moving on to now, books are diverging paths.
Yes.
We no longer have any crossover in terms of authors.
Mm-hmm.
So my next one would be Vanity Fair, which I reread at the start of this year. And Vanity Fair, it's a bit challenging. And William Thackeray is definitely not an author that fits with 21st century. Views of how to be nice to other human beings, I suppose, but it's a fantastic story, and it's got some fantastic characters in it, and a fantastic sort of analysis of what it means to make your way in the world, what it means to be a good woman. The idea of the kind of the pious Victorian wife is really kind of questioned. It's got this great Napoleonic War setting, and just coming back to it as an adult, because it's another one that I read when I was possibly a bit too young for it. I just got a lot of enjoyment out of the characters and the caricature type characters as well.
And you've nearly persuaded me that perhaps I should read, because it's one that I read as a teenager and didn't particularly like. I don't think. And
I think my issue with it the first time around was that I kind of came to it more from a Jane Austen type mindset, and in expecting Amelia Sedley to be a kind of an Austen heroine, and expecting Rebecca Sharp to get an Austen anti-heroine kind of treatment, which is not what happens.
No. So maybe I'll come back to it one day. Maybe it'll be my next, in 5 years' time, it'll be in my 5 favourite Victorian novels of the... Who knows?
Yeah. Who knows?
Oh, so my turn, and we don't have my other books, but one of the things that I've been doing over the last few years is reading Trollope's Barchester Chronicles novels, and I'd read a few Trollope sort of back in the day, as it were, but again, it's a recurring theme here. Katie, she goes on about Trollope so much, doesn't she? That I think that was part of my motivation for really working through the Barchester Chronicles, and there's a couple that I've read in the last 5 years, but and I'm going to pick Barchester Towers, but I could have picked Dr. Thorne, and there's something about Trollope's almost like the perfect Victorian novelist. He's got qualities that Dickens has, qualities that Eliot has, qualities that Gaskell has. He kind of brings it all together in a really satisfying package.
I just realised I forgot about Cranford. I could have had Cranford on my list.
Cranford!
Oh, Cranford's definitely better than Vanity Fair. Just scratch Vanity Fair.
Forget Vanity Fair.
Put Cranford in. Because that's so amusing, but also so socially aware, I suppose.
And that is something that Elizabeth Gaskell does so well, doesn't she? I couldn't choose a Gaskell, because all the Gaskells I've read in the last 5 years have been things that I had
read well before,
and although Cranford was one of my best Victorian reading experiences of the last 5 years, but
anyway,
so that's mine. What about you?
Trollope. My next one was one that I reread for Victober last year, and that was The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Bronte. And again, it's got illustrations. I love a book with illustrations. And yeah, I guess it's one that I'd read. Again, read as a teenager and not really got the implications, and I'd always loved Jane Eyre more, and kind of not really had such an appreciation for Anne, but actually reading it again and getting really into these characters and kind of realising what it was that she was addressing and appreciating the kind of the depth of what was going on in this story. I was so glad to have reread it, and so glad that Victober kind of pushed me to do that, which I guess is a running theme, is that Victober has made us approach these Victorian novels differently.
And there's something about, I think, like all the Bronte novels are ones that people often come to as a teenage, particularly as a teenage girl, that, and you know, they were relatively young when they wrote them, but they're actually books that in many ways you get more from reading them as an adult, as it were. So, and I guess, which is why we've let them in, even though they're not.
And I guess, like, I read Jane Eyre now, and I loved it as a romance, but now I read it and find it quite problematic. Whereas The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, it's got its problematic elements, but that's what it's exploring and that's what it's interested in, I suppose.
Yeah. Then my last choice was absolutely a Victober inspired read, and that's Olive by Diana Craig. And I've read a book by Diana Craig in my teens, which was John Halifax Gentleman, which was a favourite book of my mother's, because it was also a favourite book of her mother's. Her mother, who was a Victorian, she was, you know, born in Victorian times, and, you know, although she lived a lot later. And then I'd forgotten about Diana Craig as an author, and then Katie again mentioned Olive, and then, you know, some other people read it and talked about it. And it's not one of my top Victorian novels ever, but it's a favourite of the last 5 years, because it's that thing of, like, remembering that there are other Victorian authors other than, you know, like the sort of the big obvious, you know,
the big names that we've been discussing just now.
Other than Hardy and Bronte and Dickens, and, you know, that looking a little further afield is worth doing. And so that's the reason that Olive is in there. Even though the thing about Mrs. Craig is she's a little bit more pious than suits me.
Yeah,
I think. But really good novel, well worth reading, really interesting for disability, which is one of our themes this Victober. So what's your fifth one?
My fifth one, I'm cheating my way through this again because I have read Far From the Madding Crowd previously as a young teenager. It's one with illustrations. But Far From the Madding Crowd, I reread it, I think it was last year.
And for the first time since you were in your teens.
Since I was a teenager. And yeah, it's just the Hardy thing. The only new Hardy I've read recently, I suppose, is Jude the Obscure, and that's the same for you. But Jude, I just didn't love it in the way that I loved Far From the Madding Crowd, because of the characters and the kind of the rural life that you get in Far From the Madding Crowd. It's got so much drama, it's got some romance, it's got some strong female characters, it's really got things that I like to see in a book. And special mention for Far From the Madding Crowd, I was going to feature it in a video this Victober that I probably won't end up doing, but it's got one of my favourite scenes with dogs. You know where this is going. It's got Gabriel Oak has got, you know, he's got old George the dog and young George the dog, and it's a classic Hardy thing to have tragedies involving animals. But yeah, this bond that Gabriel has with his dog is quite important in the early scenes of the story. And I was thinking of making a video about favourite dogs in Victorian literature, and including Far From the Madding Crowd, because I just got a dog. So that's my honourable mention. Far From the Madding Crowd.
There we go. So those are both of our 5 favourite Victorian novels that we've read in the last 5 years.
If you've read any of them, please comment and let us know what you think. Would you count it as a favourite or would you not?
And this is absolutely now officially a tag, and all Victober participants are warmly tagged.
I'm encouraged to participate.
I may try and actually name check a few people who've been putting out interesting Victober content this year in the description, but it's open to everyone.